Now we have with us Mr. G Ramachandran, Executive Director, BSR and Co., which is a KPMG network firm. He's a most renowned chartered accountant and a consultant. Now he's with us today to guide us on how this CSR is looked upon in a chartered accountant perspective. So he will guide us through the entire CSR rule and know its implications. Sir, may I request you to present here. With a big round of applause to Mr. MGR.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity, ICTACT, for presenting this. After two people speak from the corporate sector, if a consultant or advisor has to speak, the general tendency is you actually hate it. Because when the advisor comes and talks something you know already, or the other thing is you don't want to know that. That's the reality. And especially when I'm going to talk about CSR, the legal provisions, when I had gone to meet some of the CXOs in the industry, when I explained, the first thing or the first reaction was they didn't want to know about it. That is a hard reality which hit me when I started talking about this. But nevertheless, I have a little difficult task also when I'm going to speak about this, because as we know, the Companies Act introduced the CSR concept as a mandate on the corporate sector. But I have a very peculiar situation here. Somebody in the industry is going to ask me, is it mandatory? I say yes. And we know we have a democratic society. And the next question definitely comes in from a democratic society is that, what happens if I don't comply with it? Nothing. Because that's the law. As an advisor, I have to advise you the correct position of the law as on today. Fortunately or unfortunately, if the CSR amount is not spent as mandated under the Companies Act, if you are going to ask me, is there a penalty? I would say no. So where is the incentive? Probably we will dwell upon this a little later, while I will just scan through some of the provisions, how it has evolved, what are the implications, what is the tax perspective of it, how does it hit your bottom line, and then maybe we will again answer this. To begin with, we will look at how the CSR has evolved from the Companies Act perspective, what is the spend which is required as per the law, what is the tax perspective to it, and we will go through some of the incentives probably which is been there even before the company law mandated for some of the social sector programs. In the beginning, how this has been evolved. Section 135 of the Companies Act introduced CSR. If you are a company, then you will look at the Companies Act. I come from a partnership firm. Companies Act does not apply to me. It is a different point that we still do some of the CSR activity, but it applies only to the companies. And there are some threshold limits which has been prescribed under the Companies Act, which we will look little later. Assuming you meet all those conditions, then what you have to do is also specified there. Among the board of directors, you will select and constitute a CSR committee. The CSR committee role is to formulate the CSR policy. They have to actually discuss what is that we have to do in terms of the activities. It is not constrained in a way that no other person can participate. I have seen some of the companies going out, reaching out to the employees at large, doing a poll to understand what is the policy we should adopt as a company. It's not just the CSR committee, but CSR committee has the mandate to finalize and recommend to the board of directors, yes, this is the policy which we want to do. Then the board has to approve that policy and the spend which is required under each of the activity. That's not the end of the story for the board. The law casts an obligation on each of the board member even thereafter to make sure that whatever is the minimum CSR spend which is required under the law is spent. And there is a mandatory reporting as part of the director's report, which has to be published along with your annual report. There are prescribed formats under the rules which needs to be followed. And for any reason, if the CSR amount has not been spent as per the law, then you need to give reasons also. And this is exactly where I saw the reaction came from the industry. Because after the whole year has passed, when I again met the CXOs when they were calling the board meetings to adopt the annual accounts, that time the discussion happened again on CSR. Many of the people realize, without having to spend, what do I write as the reason? That's where I think the law was quite successful in reaching to the conscience, but not prescribing a penalty. I really love this. For a change, the law reaches to the conscience of the people. To ask, tell the reason why you could not spend. If there is a genuine reason, if there was a financial difficulty or you had some budgets so you could not spend, good enough. You would be brave enough to put that on record. But if you don't have a reason, what do you write? Many people struggle. And I'm happy to note, after that, there is a tendency among the corporate that they will comply, not only for this year's obligation, but also to the unspent of the earlier year. That's the change I have seen over the last 1 year. Just to see the trigger points, what are the conditions prescribed under the Companies Act which will make a company spend the CSR amount? If you have a financial strength, either the net worth is above 500 crores, or your turnover is above 1,000 crores, or if you have a profit of just 5 crores, then the conditions are satisfied. You are required to commit yourself to expend under the CSR policy. Now somebody can ask, last 3 years I made a profit, but current year I don't have that profit. Am I required to still spend that amount? The answer is yes. The condition as on today is, last 3 years is the benchmark for you to come under the CSR ambit. However, if you are making losses, which probably has taken away your reserves, or probably your trend in the future indicates that you need to create the buffer, you can give those reasons. See, the law only requires you to look at what is your scenario, spend if the law applies to you. If you are not able to spend, give the reasons. If you have a valid reasons, it will be accepted. So, no issues. So, in terms of the consequence, if your company is coming within the ambit of the CSR regime, then as I said, there will be a CSR committee which will be formed out of the board of directors. 3 or more directors can be called upon to be a CSR committee member. One of them has to be independent director. However, in case of a private limited company, there is a relaxation that you don't have to have an independent director. And if the private limited company is comprising only of 2 directors, then only those 2 directors will be constituted in the CSR committee. So the CSR committee, as we saw a little bit earlier, has to formulate the CSR policy. Yes, you want to contribute to the Clean Ganga movement? Very well, you can do so. But there is one river in Chennai also. Yeah, we forgot that it is a river. We call more that as a Kuvam. Why don't you look that also? Give a preference to the local area when you are doing a CSR spend. The idea is to develop your surrounding. Though it's not a mandate, it's a preference which you have to give. Recommend those activities to the board and also quantitatively mention what is the amount which you will have to spend in each activity. CSR committee also will actually monitor the implementation of the policies and report to the board from time to time. While CSR committee does this, the board has an obligation to mention in the director's report, and therefore they also have certain obligations mentioned under the law. First, they have to disclose who are all part of the CSR committee. And they have to approve in the board meeting whatever is the policy and the amount to be spent. And they have a prescribed format for reporting that unspent amount as part of the director's report. And ensure in every board meeting, at least document or ask as to what's happening on the CSR front. So when the board of minutes reflect that there is a discussion among the directors as to what happened on the CSR policy, it shows a very healthy sign that the board of directors are actively monitoring this. As opposed, if only at the time of adoption of annual accounts in the year end, if the board of directors are discussing on the CSR policy, there is no active involvement of the board in that CSR spend. So that's the difference. One has to make sure that the discussion happens in every board meeting. And what happens? As I said, the consequence of not spending the amount, there is no penalty. But there is a penalty prescribed and probably an imprisonment also if you don't disclose in the director's report. Very interesting. So there are certain particulars which you have to report in the director's report, like foreign exchange earnings, technology adoption, etc. Among that, CSR is also one of the items. So if you don't disclose, then there is a general penalty provision and general imprisonment which can happen for any of the items which is required to be disclosed in the director's report and not disclosed. That can get protected. And that's exactly why I said I love this, because they have indirectly hint. If you have not spent, you cannot just leave it as it is. You have to give a reasons in writing in your director's report. If not, there is a penalty and probable imprisonment. But when you start writing, then it touches your conscience. One of the important things I recall as I speak, is that somewhere in December 2014, in the last winter session, there was a question from one of the MPs in the Rajya Sabha. They asked, is the current legal backing for implementation of CSR adequate? Are we required to bring in an amendment to impose a penalty or something which is required to make sure that this amount will be spent by the corporates? The current finance minister at that time has clarified that we are hoping that the corporate sector will spend the amount which they are required to do. And the current regime or the current regulations are adequate enough to ensure that. And this is exactly what they are looking at. They are looking at corporates to come up on their own, not find some excuse, but act according to their conscience. That's exactly what the government is also looking at. Schedule 7, they specify some of the activities which constitute as CSR activity. This is under the Companies Act. So if I look at from a theme of the current day session, then the second item is something which will go well. Promoting education and employment enhancing vocation skills. These are the activities probably go along with the today's session. Of course, we have seen how, as an example, my earlier two co-speakers have given some examples how the corporates have built on these principles. And this is one of the item which is listed as a specified CSR activity. If you are going to do that, yes, you can report that in the director's report. Let's look at some of the examples. How do you compute what is the amount to be spent? This is just an example. Assuming the net profit for financial year 12-13 is around 125 crores. And for financial year 13-14 is around 175 crores. Financial year 14-15 is 225 crores. All put together around 525 crores. You look at the average net profit for the last 3 years, which is around 175 crores. Compute 2% of this amount. Works out to around 3.5 crores. This is the amount which you will have to spend in the current year, which is financial year 15-16. So right in the beginning of the year, you know what is the amount you have to spend. It's based on last 3 years amount. Quite easy to have this adopted in the first board meeting of the year. This is where probably some of the discussion happened when I initially interacted with the CXOs in the industry. Whatever I am going to spend is a mandate as per the law. If it is a mandate as per the law, I should be eligible for a tax deduction while paying my income tax. Well, yes, there was a lobby also with the finance minister last year. We represented on behalf of some of the associations that yes, if it is a mandate of the law, why don't you give a concession in terms of the tax deduction? In Finance Act 2014, Finance Minister then clarified in the Parliament. He said that this amount will not be allowed as a tax deduction under Section 37 of the Income Tax Act. What Section 37 of the Income Tax Act talks about is that if you incur any expenditure for the purpose of business, which is not personal in nature, which is not something which is of capital goods, then it will be allowed as a business expenditure. It's called a generic residual law, which allows any expenditure which you incur for the business to be allowed as a business expenditure. He clarified that it will not be allowed under this particular section. Now, when we looked at if it is not allowed under this particular section, is there some other sections which can actually allow this kind of expenditure? We realized that there are certain sections which allow you certain benefits, tax benefits, for certain social expenditure, even before the Companies Act mandated this. These provisions were existing even before, and they were encouraging from a tax perspective for the CSR. Let's take the first one. So if you are going to give a contribution to a trust or a society which has obtained the approval under Section 80G, what you normally call as a donation, if you are making that kind of a contribution even under the CSR program, you get a 50% deduction under Section 80G. And there are certain programs which are approved under a particular section called 35AC, basically the social development programs. If you are going to contribute for those purposes, you get 100% deduction as well. And going further, very specifically to today's theme, if you are going to do a skill development program, you can also get a 150% deduction. And these are all already there in the Income Tax Act, even before the introduction of CSR as per the Companies Act. So while one set of the people whom I interacted when I told about this, they said, wow, this is a very good thing. At least I don't incur additional tax cost on the CSR spend. While interestingly, I met few people also who said, I love this idea. Now I'm going to spend the amount which I'm going to save by way of a tax in pumping into that activity again. They were very interested in spending that amount rather than paying the tax. I would rather do the pumping into the CSR activity. So that kind of a reaction also came when I shared this idea. So these are some of the typical examples as to how the tax outgo would vary depending upon the program which you are choosing. I don't want to take long in this. It's basically giving as a purview as to what exactly this section is. Basically, this section is dealing with something called the National Committee is there in Delhi, which approves specific social development programs. It takes literally a year to get those approvals. So it's a rigorous process. It's not very easy also. You have to apply to them, saying that this is the particular activity which we are going to do. Say, for example, if you are constructing a large school in a rural area, you come up with the details as to what you are going to do, how it is going to benefit in that area, present it to the National Committee. National Committee sits quarterly once, they look at it, you present it very well in terms of giving photographs of the status, actual status, intended benefit, the demographic profile of the area where you are building, all those things you give to them. They consider all those things very objectively and they grant an approval. Once they grant an approval, you are eligible to have 100% claim on those expenditure, though it is not related to the business of the company which is incurring the expenditure. That's important. Because if you look at 37, section 37, it says expenditure for the business will be allowed. Here it is not for the purpose of the business at all, but still you get 100% of the amount which you are incurring on that particular scheme. Here are the specified projects or the schemes under which you can go and approach this National Committee for an approval. Now, considering the theme of the day, I would probably look at these as some of the things where you can contribute to the Digital India or the Skill India. The ones on the left probably will be for the Digital India, basically spreading the literacy across. On the right will be for the skill development. So depending upon what your choice is, you can go and apply to the National Committee. The other section which I talked about is section 35 CCD. Here basically you have to get approval from National Skill Development Authority. And once you get the approval from the National Skill Development Authority, you are eligible to get 150% of the amount which you are spending. It's a clear incentive from the government to encourage skill development programs. The process is again not so easy. It's a rigorous process. The eligible company will have to undertake a project. It has to be in a earmarked separate facility. It cannot be just like that. You have a training room in your company, you can just run a project under that. You have to earmark this as a training facility and get an approval for that. In this, the one additional point which you need to consider is when you are going for an approval, the authority will also take inputs from the income tax authorities. The Central Board of Direct Taxes through the local commissioner, wherever the jurisdiction your training facility is, will give a report to National Skill Development Authority, and based on that, your approval will be granted. So it's again a time-taking process which takes roughly 7 to 8 months. But if you are able to do that on a large scale, definitely you are able to plow back. As I said, those who are interested in plowing back those tax savings into the further CSR scheme are going to do it more happily. With this, I end my session with just a last thought on what probably other speakers also reiterated and what I also have observed. I was in Hyderabad before I had moved to Chennai. We all know Chandrababu Naidu, how he was pioneering the concept of bringing the digitalization in the Andhra Pradesh government. The one chief minister who has a reputation to carry a laptop everywhere, doing a Skype meeting across with all the government officials, etc. One thing which he also realized and implemented is creating e-Seva centers across. The reason is the government can implement a digital India and digitalize all the government departments. But if you don't have the people who can understand and access those facilities, those programs are going to fail. And that is where probably as an intermediary, he has to create the e-Seva centers where people of all class can walk in, access those officials sitting there, and whatever they wanted to do, they were doing to do. But if we are able to educate the people, give the necessary skills, then we are looking at not having those centers, but the people themselves online doing things what is required for them. So, and I think that's where probably the corporate sector can play a role as mandated by the law and as per concessions given by the within the legal framework. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much for giving that detailed implications of the. May I request Mr. Lakshmi, Mr. Ranade, and Mr. MGR to come up to the dais, and we'll take quick 2 or 3 questions specific to the presentations of the first 3 speakers. Yeah, can you help passing the mic? Let's have 3 questions so that we go on to the next session in scheduled time. Can you pass on the mic here? One gentleman. Oh, okay. So I would request you to keep your question short, and if you can address exactly to whom you would like to question, so that I would request them to take up the question.
Hello. So this question is to Mr. Lakshmi Narayanan. So first, hats off to your excellent speech, sir. Your skilling the public, you will allow the CSR for a pre-set of skills, or is a CSR corporate can devise its own skilling program, submit it for your approval, and go ahead with it, sir?
I'll rephrase that question and try and answer that. The contribution that you make, let's say you provide some scholarship for students to attend skilling programs, that can be considered as CSR. Again, I would ask MGR to confirm that after I finish. I think it is considered as a CSR expenditure. If you want to set up your own CSR wing, a skilling academy to which you contribute money and you skill people, whatever model that you adopt, hopefully a not-for-profit model, whatever, that may be considered as CSR. But if you want a tax break, you probably have to go through the steps that were presented in the last slide. That's my understanding. The position that we have taken is, in Cognizant, what we do is, the company will every year provide a certain amount to a cognizant foundation. Our CSR activities are multifold. One of them being an independent cognizant foundation that looks at projects. And the foundation can decide to participate in the skilling program by working with various skilling agencies, training institutions, etc. And so that's something that is covered as part of the CSR spend, but we are not seeking any tax benefit for the funds that we are donating to the foundation. I don't know if MGR would want to add something.
Yeah, the enhancing the vocational skills, as you had seen in the Schedule 7, the second bullet I talked about. So there are two things in that. One is the education and another is the vocational skills. So that constitutes a CSR expenditure. And in terms of the tax expenditure, as he rightly said, you will have to follow the procedure. If you don't want a tax break, you are happy to do the way you want to do.
My question to Mr. MGR. We are a company that we might not come under the bracket of how it is mentioned by the government. Are we eligible to process for 35 AC and 35 CCD?
The tax break is independent. As I said, even before the introduction of the CSR mandate under the Companies Act, this provision existed. So it doesn't matter whether you are falling under the CSR mandate or not. If you want to do that, you can do that and you can claim, follow the procedure. That's it.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
I have a question for Mr. MGR. You said 3 years average should be taken for CSR initiative. I wonder whether all these corporate accounts today are waiting for 3 years to start off. If you visit a website of a corporate account, it is so digitally well developed. You don't have to go into the Companies Act to read the rules and regulations. Most of the companies print out in their website what is CSR, what are the rules, regulations. But if you go into that organization, call on them and ask them who is heading your CSR, they point out to HR head. When you go to the HR head, he says, I have no idea. We are in the process of developing a CSR team and trying to appoint a CSR director. This is not a reply from an ordinary company. I would have gone into about 100 companies in Chennai. Most of the major automobile industries I have gone. Today they say, Thompson, you have come at the right time. We are going to formulate the rules and regulations. Is it like making the helmet a mandatory rule in Chennai? CSR is also on the verge. I wish somebody will throw some lights on this.
No, this is exactly the experience I shared as well. So when I started off the discussion, it was as if they don't want to hear about it. But the things have changed now when they, as I said, when I asked them, what is the reason you want to give? Today, if you see some of the annual reports, the only reason which you will be able to find is that we have adopted a CSR policy and we are in the process of identifying an appropriate agency to implement it or something like that. But the thing is, the realization has come to the organization that, yes, if today I have written this, what will I write next year? And that's where I saw a change. But you are absolutely right, and that's exactly what I shared also, that there is no response as such in the last year, but in the current year I am seeing a change, which is a welcome move.
I'm sure this question will be well answered again by the 3 large corporates who will be part of the next session. So with this, let me thank Mr. Lakshminarayanan, Mr. Prashant Ranade and Mr. M.D. Ramachandran.